Here we have part 4 of our content on emotions and happiness. So happiness is what we all pursue, what we mostly want for our children. So it's a really valuable thing to consider in research in psychology. And in psychology, it has some measurable components. First of all, psychologists tend to measure it in two ways. First, life satisfaction, how well you think your life is going. And how do we know? We just ask. That's it. Nobody can rate your life satisfaction except you. And then the second is emotional well-being. And that's the tendency to express more positive than negative emotions at any moment in time or over a given length of time. So your actual experiences of emotion are gathered through like a beeper that goes off intermittently, say over a 1-month period, and every time it goes off, you're asked what emotions you're experiencing. And then those are categorized into positive or negative emotions. And if you're experiencing more positive versus negative, that would be the measure. And happiness is important. Just a few reasons. It's associated with creativity, with higher performance at work, with better health demonstrated by reduced pain, better sleep, stronger cardiovascular system, stronger immune system. So lots of good outcomes for feeling happy. So we're not all that good at knowing what makes us happy in some ways. So affective forecasting. In psychology, this word affect is different from the word affect, as in something will affect you. Affect is referring to your emotional state. So it's in a way synonymous with emotion. So let's call it emotional forecasting, predicting future emotions such as whether an event will result in happiness or anger or sadness and for how long. And the example, one example is, can you predict how happy or unhappy you would be after a romantic breakup? And it turns out that just from this one example, there are other studies as well, that we're not actually that good at predicting it. So what they did is they took two groups of people. One group are lucky people who have never experienced a breakup, and those people predicted how they would feel. And the other is the actual satisfaction of people who had broken up. And so participants forecast that a romantic breakup would make them less happy than was actually true. So they both predicted that they would be worse off than they actually were. And we'll look at why this is in a little bit. So we often assume that we will like or dislike a future event more than we actually do when it happens. And then we assume that positive or negative emotions will last longer than they do. So this happens for a few reasons. First is immune neglect. And immune neglect is the tendency for people to underestimate their own resilience in response to difficult life events. So I have sort of a fear of if I was ever like confined or locked up or couldn't walk. And I sort of have a prediction that that would really, really disturb me, bother me, and I would be very sad. And so immune neglect suggests that I'm wrong, that I actually underestimate the capacity of my emotional immune system to protect me from that. And that in fact, research shows that painful, difficult experiences often are less upsetting than we expect them to be. So people are biased, often expecting breakups to be more traumatic and depressing than they actually are. In other words, immune neglect is like another way of stating that we're poor at affective forecasting, but this one indicates that we do have a protective system in place, just like our physical immune system protects us from disease, so does our emotional immune system protect us from the experiencing long pain of painful life experiences. Knowing what makes us happy also is, we also have a tendency toward focalism. That is, we tend to have our little dreams or predictions of what will make us happy, but then we focus on that one thing and neglect other things that might, still come into play to reduce that happiness. And it tends to go like this. As soon as I fill in the blank here, get a new job, as soon as I find a romantic partner, as soon as I move into a bigger house, as soon as I start college, whatever it is, and then we think life is going to be so good. And so we can see this couple dreaming about how good life is going to be in a new house, but they forget that by focusing on that one main event, we forget to neglect to consider that life will still have its ups and downs even after the big event. I bet lots of you can think of examples of this as well. And so, all of these ideas that we're getting, it's a good idea to be aware of it. And so as soon as you start to do that, as soon as I get my degree, life will be better. Just keep aware that there's always a balance of things, and don't get so committed to that big shift to automatic happiness, because then you put yourself in a situation of being vulnerable to the life events that bring you down, and even more vulnerable because you'd also have a defeat of your expectations. So pursuing happiness, there's so much wonderful research on this. I feel like we're just hardly skimming the surface. But we do know that in correlational studies, higher levels of happiness tend to be linked to more successful social relationships, higher levels of religious engagement, and living in countries with individual rights and economic opportunities. So in other words, people who have more successful social relationships tend to report higher happiness. People who are more involved in their religion report higher levels of happiness. And then living in these countries where people have rights and economic opportunities doesn't necessarily mean wealth per se. It means the opportunity to live comfortably and have freedom. So there are some other factors. Age and gender are relatively unimportant, although we do know that happiness tends to increase with age if a person's health is good. And if one's health is bad, we don't see that same effect. So if you were to predict in what decade of life will you be the happiest, well, or not you in particular, but in one decade of life do people report the highest levels of happiness? This will probably be older than you think. And so as long as people's health is good. If health is not good, then unfortunately that doesn't impact as much. And then you might think money will bring you happiness, but this too is limited. This is true. Having more money corresponds with increases in happiness, but only insofar as your needs are met. So as soon as your needs are met, you have a comfortable, safe home, you're provided for, you have what you need. After that, happiness does not increase any further. So having too much does not contribute to happiness. So these experts on happiness can talk to you about it really far better than I can. So I'm asking that you watch these two short videos. They're short, they're 20 minutes each, but I think you'll find them engaging. Dr. Mathieu Ricard has become a monk. He follows Buddhist practices, and he also has his PhD. And I think you'll find perhaps a philosophical bent in what he talks about that might be appealing to you. And Dr. Dan Gilbert is a Western psychologist who's for his career studied happiness, and he's written a number of books about happiness. And he goes over some really interesting research about happiness. He kind of talks fast and gives you a lot of information, but I think you'll find it interesting. So to conclude this chapter, we can identify first that emotions have a biological and a cultural basis. We talked about universal expression and identification of common emotions, so those ability to identify disgust, fear, and so forth is universal. The physiological responses are also universal, and cultural differences in display rules. Secondly, we talked about social relationships, and we talked about how they're forged with and impacted by emotion. So in interpersonal relationships, flirtation, that initial stage, is emotional with certain expression guidelines or practices. The decision to enter a relationship is forged by emotion, and then staying in a relationship, commitment, are impacted by emotion. We touched on the idea of oxytocin as the commitment hormone, and that we'll discuss that more later. And touch is important in fostering success and confidence. Then we talked about how reasoning and cognition is impacted by emotion. So we do tend to perceive situations through a lens based on our emotional state. So if we're angry, we're going to perceive anger or situations that will generate anger, where other people wouldn't see the same thing if their emotional state is different. And we react emotionally more quickly than we react cognitively. Hence, and sometimes we stick to that emotional reaction. That's our gut instinct. And the findings of the trolley study and a couple of other examples explain that. And finally, we talked about happiness. Happiness being measured via life satisfaction and emotional direction. We have poor, what's called affective forecasting, which seems to be attributable to immune neglect and focalism, tendency to focus on one event and forget about the others. And people with healthier relationships, high religious engagement, living in a free, economically viable country tend to be happier.